think I know most of you, but those I don't know, I'm Leslie Sickerman, I'm the Township's planner. And tonight's workshop is on lake water quality, and we have two great speakers tonight. We have Goudy from the DEQ, he's from the office in Cadillac, and Sarah Rudd from the Watershed Center. We're not part of her watershed, but she's really...
Get a little bit in my watershed.
Oh, okay, yeah.
A little sliver.
And but she's got lots of great information, and Greg's going to give us kind of a short presentation, and then I think it's going to be a little bit open-ended to hear more about what you'd like to talk about. We can write down ideas, figure out what kinds of things we might want to focus more discussions on, and take it from there. So, and just so you know, Plug, I did talk to, or I communicated with Chris, and he had a different, another obligation tonight, but I told him there might be some spin-off workshops and he'd like to get involved. So, and we are videotaping tonight's proceedings so that we're able to show it to our planning commissioners and anyone else who's interested, so it'll be posted on our website. So,
that's why I'm hiding over here.
yeah, well.
Okay, we have a nice small group, so we can do this fairly informally, and I'd encourage any of you to just shout out a question if you have one as we go through this. I'm just going to do a basic review probably for many of you of lake conditions, how we measure whether we have good water quality or not, what causes some of the problems, and how we can address those if we do have some of those. And so I guess you know the first one. Next slide. Of course, on the top of the list, we want to have conditions that support good human health when we're using that water. So we typically use it for recreation, swimming, boating, fishing. And for fishing, you want to have nice populations of desirable fish that you can catch. And then you also want fish that you can eat. And as many of you know, there are fish consumption advisories for many lakes in Michigan for various things, and there's a generic statewide advisory for mercury contamination in some fish. And then I put drinking water up there, not because we want to drink the lake water, but because it does have a hydrologic connection to groundwater, and some people have shallow wells where they're drawing water, and that the lake can potentially influence those as well. And then irrigation, some people will draw water from a lake to irrigate their property. And that's okay, riparian owners have the right to withdraw water to do something like that, as long as they don't impair state designated uses like the ability of people to fish or the other critters that are there and other people's use of that water. Just as a little bit more on that, in case any of you I know some people have been concerned about that over the years because of lake level fluctuation. The people that have the right to use the water cannot transfer that right to anybody else. So if there's another parcel across the road and they want to use the lake water and approach a riparian property owner for permission to put something across their property, the riparian property owner doesn't have the ability to grant that authority to that other person. It's only for that riparian property owner. And in fact, even if the riparian property owner owns another parcel across the road, if it's a separate parcel, they can't even use the water on that parcel. It's only for the parcel that's adjacent to the water. Okay, next slide. And then, of course, we want healthy biological communities, fish, bugs and plankton, other things, plants, and then habitat for all those. And then we're also concerned about, the aesthetics of the lake. And we want it to be, clear, not cloudy or turbid to some extent. Now, we would hope to see some turbidity in lakes from plankton and those other things that serve as the basis of the aquatic food chain. So we don't want totally clear water like some people think they want when they move from downstate up here and think they're living on a pool and want it to look like that. Then of course we don't want oil, other pollutants, algae, scum, and trash. Don't want any odors. Next. For human health, how do we measure the status of that? One of the things that we do we have water quality standards that apply to certain uses of the water. And to protect public health, we have a water quality standard for Escherichia coli, which is an indicator bacteria. In itself, it doesn't cause disease, but it is something that's in the guts of mammals and is an indicator that there is some potential fecal contamination. And just so it could be from us, it could be from raccoons or deer or dogs. So just because we find that doesn't necessarily mean that there are pathogens there or that it's from a human source. But then we have different levels that we look for. The first two, for a monthly average, we don't want to see any more than 130 counts per 100 milliliters of water. And that's for total body contact, which is based on ingestion. So things like swimming. And then at no time do we want a maximum greater than 300. And then we also have a separate level for what we refer to as partial body contact. So that would be things like boating or fishing, that kind of thing, where you aren't, your risk of ingesting water is a lot less. And then fish tissue, toxic metals, and organics, those are some of the things that lead to the fish consumption advisories. So we measure those in fish tissue. And then some of you may have heard some discussions that have come up more recently, sort of with the advent of zebra mussels in the area and the way they filter the plankton out of the pelagic or open water food chain and sort of send that energy to the bottom of a lake. And what that has done is a couple things. It's removed the desirable plankton species and left behind what are typically the more undesirable ones, the ones that are too large for the zebra mussels to filter out. And so there's more of them left behind, and then also there's less competition for the food that the plankton consume. And so you end up with larger populations of these nuisance algae. And there are some of those that actually can produce some toxins that can cause health problems for both humans and animals if you consume a lot of contaminated water. So some of you may have heard some of that. And then how we measure aesthetics, that's a tougher one. We just have visual or smell to check to see how that looks. Then we have Secchi disc. It's supposed to be Secchi disc, not Secchi disc. But that's the little, some of you probably know that, the black and white triangle that you lower down from a boat and see how far it goes down before it disappears and it reappears when you pull it back up. Gives you an indicator of water clarity, or how clear it is, how far the sunlight's penetrating. Because another thing that's happened now with zebra mussels that have sort of cleared some of the plankton from the water column is the light penetrates further, and so now you have plant growths that are in deeper water than what they used to be. Okay, I guess that's it on that one. Okay, for the biological communities, we have some water quality parameters that we look at. Nutrients are one, primarily phosphorus. And up here where we have good water quality, the general thought on what levels we like to see is we don't want to see any levels higher than whatever they are in whatever water body we're looking at. So we try to keep them there or lower. We don't have a numerical standard for nutrients in the state because conditions vary so much from one part of the state to another. And so the narrative standard essentially refers to you want to have nutrient levels, concentrations of phosphorus and other things low enough that you don't cause nuisance plant growths or other things that would impair our use of the water. Then dissolved oxygen, there are different numbers for different types of lakes. For warm water lakes, we don't want to see it drop below 5 milligrams per liter, parts per million. For cold water lakes, it's a higher level. We don't want to get below 7. And then, I guess that's sort of what temperature is referring to, is you have different regimes that you treat differently when you're looking to see how the water quality for a particular area looks. We want to see different conditions in a trout stream than we would say a warmer water stream. And then there's some other miscellaneous parameters. For aquatic populations, we want to, typically they're evaluated by looking at the diversity, how many different species or kinds there are. of the different populations, as well as their population dynamics or their structure, how many young ones you have versus older ones, what their growth rates are, things like that. And then, of course, you need habitat for those populations to thrive, and then we want them to be disease-free. Okay, next. Okay, what causes some of these problems? Under the human health category, look at pathogens or disease-causing organisms first. Again, the E. coli are an indicator bacteria indicating the possible presence of pathogens. And sources of those are septic systems. And if you don't take anything more away from tonight than this, I want you to sort of remember this concept. So this line is going to be the surface of the ground. Okay, it goes down, comes back up, and then we have our lake here. Blue marker. Okay, and so a lot of people think, all right, here's our lake, and this is what we want to be concerned about. But in reality, the groundwater goes across like this, and then this side, and so the lake, in many cases up here where we have sandy soils and with a lot of groundwater in them, a lake is just where the surface topography or the surface of land has dipped down into the groundwater table. And so what happens, this is one reason why different lakes, when conditions get dry and people are concerned about lake levels, some of them vary a lot more than others, has to do with the extent of groundwater around them, as well as their surface area to volume ratio and how much water evaporates and whether they have a stream coming in or not. So, but why I brought this up related to septic systems is you might have somebody who has a house here. And say their septic system is back here. And they think, well, all right, that's good, certainly better than over here. And they think that's a long ways from the lake. But in reality, it's not, because it only has to go, this stuff from the septic system only has to go this far before it's in the groundwater, which is eventually going to make its way to the lake. So that's a real important concept to keep in mind, because septic systems, and this affects other things too, like the application of fertilizer, pet waste, and stuff like that. Septic systems are just designed to remove solids. So it removes the solids, and then the liquids go into a drain field that drains that water into the soil. And when septic drain fields are new, the soil particles will absorb some of the nutrients and other things, the phosphorus that are associated with that discharge. But as the drain fields get older, they may still function fine as far as getting rid of the water. So nobody thinks there's any concern about the septic system. But if the soil has taken up as much of the phosphorus as it can, the phosphorus is just going to go straight through down the groundwater and eventually to the lake. So that's another reason for advocating the regular pumping or maintenance of septic systems to try to minimize this amount of phosphorus that you get in the lake. And it also is relevant to potential pathogens as well, and other products like you're probably hearing a lot more about, some of the pharmaceuticals and hormones and other things that they're finding in the water now because they're looking for it. This doesn't do anything to treat any of that, and neither do our municipal wastewater treatment facilities either. None of those are designed to treat any of those kinds of products. Okay, other sources of potential pathogens are pet and other animal waste, illegal connection to storm drains, decomposition of plant and animal material. This last one is sort of referring to, the botulism that some of you have heard about. Again, the wonderful zebra aquatic mussels are contributing to that. They're generating these dense growths along the bottom of a lake, and then those materials break loose. They wash up to shore sometimes. I imagine some of you may have had to deal with that. And the decomposition of that material uses up the oxygen in the water, so you get anoxic areas without oxygen, and you can have some of the species of bacteria there that actually contribute to botulism. And that's why we've had some of the bird die-offs along the Great Lakes. Essentially, the fish, some of the fish that the birds are eating consume some of this contaminated, you know, the algae or the other critters among it, particularly when it washes up on shore and there are dead fish mixed in with it, and then they get botulism and die. So that's another. And toxics, we have metals and organics, primarily what we're looking at there. Comes from urban stormwater runoff, industrial municipal discharges. A lot of it actually comes from the atmosphere. It's atmospheric deposition when it rains, a lot of the stuff. It comes out of smokestacks or car exhaust, then comes down onto the ground, onto the roads, and washes off into the lakes or streams. And you can get wet, that's wet deposition. You also get dry deposition happening without the storm event. And then spills, historic sites of contamination, there's still some of those around. Next. For biological communities and their populations and densities, the things that affect the viability of those populations are all the things I already mentioned, plus some of these other ones: invasive species, climate change, and then habitat loss. And you have several different habitat issues that we're concerned about: wetland habitats, shoreline habitats, woody structure, and then also the gravelly areas that fish need to spawn. And then also some of them use plants as well. Okay. So, I mentioned the nutrients, primarily phosphorus. Phosphorus is the nutrients that is the limiting element for most of our water systems here. Again, from septic systems, fertilizers, we now have a statewide program in place where people are not supposed to use any phosphorus fertilizers on their lawns unless they're starting a new lawn or they're doing a garden or something like that. Stormwater runoff, atmospheric deposition again for that as well. And then sediment is a source of concern for, again, covering up the gravelly areas that you might have in some of the shallow areas of a lake. Also, I lost my thought. Anyway, sources, driveways, roads, construction sites, other upland erosion areas, fields, ag fields and lawns. Next.
A big source of sediment up here is sanding in the wintertime on the roads. It really adds a lot of sand to the streets.
Right. Yeah, and then chloride's another issue from salt that they use sometimes. And we've got, well, actually Sarah's organization funded a project where they did some work. Some researchers from Michigan State did some work up here looking at chloride concentrations in water. And they can see in the groundwater where it's expanding over the years, but nobody really knows what to do about that or how significant a problem that is for the lakes or streams. All right. How to prevent and fix problems. The main thing we want to focus on is preventing problems, because once you have a problem in the lake, it's there. You aren't going to be able to get rid of the source of the problem in most cases. Usually things people are doing, like to treat nuisance plant growths and other things, are essentially responding to a symptom of a problem. So the algae is growing because of the nutrients in the lake, and you can kill it off, but then it's just going, those nutrients just recycle again, and you have the same thing to deal with the next year. So one of the key things is really education. The behaviors that people have and the personal choices that we all make have a big impact on our water resources and how they'll be protected in the future. From the federal and state level, the programs that are in place pretty much address industrial municipal discharges, so that's pretty much taken care of. The sources that we have to deal with now that are contributing to problems are what we refer to as non-point sources. They don't come from a pipe, so you find them from a field or a road or a lawn. And the way you deal with that is addressing how the land itself is used. So if you have a field, are you maintaining it in a way that minimizes the amount of erosion and water runoff from that field to the water bodies. And so some of the key things that we would look at under land use would be, taking septic systems out of the equation entirely, putting in a sewer system. If someone asks me, well, when they do ask me, what's the best thing we can do for a lake, put a sewer around it and get rid of those septic systems. And of course, that's expensive, and a lot of people object to that because of the cost. What I often mention in those cases is think of it as a long-term insurance policy. If you're a riparian owner and have property on a lake, that's going to help maintain the quality of the lake and the value of your property, compared to if the lake gets very eutrophic and you end up with nuisance plants and nobody wants to live there because you can't swim, can't boat, it's smelly. And so you can really look at it as a main system. Again, for the septic systems where you do have them still, they're designed to treat solids, so if you can pump them out occasionally, that minimizes the amount of phosphorus that they are going to contribute to a lake. And of course, you want to properly site and maintain those. Michigan is the only state in the country that does not have a statewide code for septic systems. So there's no code for the design of those, the construction of those, and how they should be sited. That varies from county to county or health district to health district. And there have been several attempts to do a statewide code, and I think there's one sort of underway now, but they never seem to get passed. And so we're the only state that doesn't have a statewide code of some kind. So some counties are doing things like point of sale programs where a septic system needs to be inspected at the time of sale. And there's some other things. A very important practice is the idea of having green belts along the shoreline, vegetation that's not mowed, that's preferably native, and it essentially captures a lot of the runoff that would otherwise be going directly into a lake. And during a rainstorm, that's great because it collects some of the solids and other nutrients that may make it there, and then it's used for the plants. The setbacks refers to how far buildings are set back, and that often gives you more room for greenways if you have appropriate setbacks. We want to minimize impervious surfaces. Those are areas like roofs and hard surface driveways that rainwater cannot percolate or get through, and it just runs off. And that is a major indicator of problems in a watershed. Studies typically show that if you have 8 to 10% impervious surface in a watershed, you start to see signs of degradation. And there are very few places where once you reach a certain impervious surface cover that it ever reverses itself and goes the other way. So programs to address those are important. And that is one way you minimize stormwater runoff. Others is to try to maintain the stormwater on site. And so programs that are in place in some places, Grand Traverse County as an example, now most of the townships, I think, have the program where if you develop a site, you don't want any more water to leave that site after development has left it before it was developed. So those are important as well too. And if you have that done at the site level, you need very small depressions and other areas to handle this runoff, whereas if it goes to a ditch from multiple sites and goes on down the road to somewhere else, you need a big retention area to hold it. And so then you have not only the issue of maintaining that, but the amount of land that it takes up and other things. If we use fertilizer, we want to use phosphorus-free fertilizer. Land use planning is a mechanism to potentially incorporate some of these things as well as others. And you also want to keep in mind concepts like having a sustainable community, both in terms of quality of life, economics, and other things. And one of the tools that you can use in land use planning is, this has ordinances and potentially enforcement. There's no point in having an ordinance on something if it isn't going to be enforced. So the two sort of go together. But there's other tools for land use planning that can be used as well too, for education, just soliciting input and the conversations that take place in the community are other tools. And then Another tool is what's referred to as a watershed management plan. Those are plans that essentially look at all these issues for a particular lake watershed, the area that drains into a particular lake or stream, and identifies actions that can be taken to protect or restore the water quality conditions in that area. And there are, as some of you know, there is a watershed management plan for Long Lake that was put together several years ago. So that's just a quick, hopefully it was a quick review. And may
Before
have
Greg moves on from this slide, I should say I brought a bunch of pamphlets and brochures from our office, because every nonprofit has their own slew of brochures and everything. But I do have some about septic systems and green belts and rain gardens, which are those kind of depressions on your property that you can get to collect and infiltrate stormwater into the ground. So they're in some brochure racks by the front door there. So on your way out, feel free to peruse that and take whatever you want, however many you want.
And I brought some copies of this, so I'll set them out for people to take on their way out if you're interested. And then also, Leslie has a copy that she can email to folks or that might be interested as well. So that's all I had. So basically, I'd like to try to answer any questions you have, and Sarah as well. That's what we're really here for tonight, is to try to
I'll even come to the front.
Okay.
I'll sit up here, we can make it informal.
I have a question if no one else does. I'm sure they'll have some later, but we just added to our zoning ordinance a provision allowing people to keep chickens in certain areas of the township, including on lakefront properties. I just wondered how you felt about that.
Say make sure their poop doesn't wash up into the water. They're warm-blooded animals, so.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have ordinances or land use planning, you're dealing with what the local community wants, and if they want that, that's what they want. And, but we would encourage the chickens and their waste to be, as far back from the edge of the shoreline as.
I think chicken waste is high in phosphorus, isn't it? I mean, it's really high.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, then you also have the food. A lot of the food ends up on the ground and not eaten as well. So, yeah.
Just more of a general question. Is it kind of a statement of fact that our inland lakes anywhere, just take our area, northern Michigan, are in a natural way of eutrophication, just by the vegetation around the lakes, the lily pads in a lot of our lakes with the native weeds, but as organic material does in fact do its natural thing, die off and regrow, it's a, I know depending on the lake, how shallow, how warm, and Long Lake, we were very, very fortunate with the depth of it and with the overall nature of it. But is it a fact that all of our lakes are really going through a slow, gradual process of eutrophication, inland lakes?
Sure. Yeah, there's a natural process of eutrophication caused by the things that you mentioned. Essentially, they're the low spot in the landscape. And so when you have rainstorms, the organic debris and residue and decomposed material is eventually going to make its way to the lake. And over time, that will increase the nutrient levels in the lake. It'll make it shallower. You'll get more plant growth and that kind of thing. So there is this natural evolution of the lake, but it's usually, without our help, it takes place over a geological time frame. It's not something that we would see happen in our lifetimes generally, without something that we did to accelerate that.
Right. And just to complete that, because like I live on a small lake adjacent to Long, Nicky Lake, a little cabin out there, and it's beautiful because you can, around the edges, particularly in the spring, you can see where the groundwater from the water table you're mentioning there just comes in. As you walk by it, it's cool. As you see it, there's a little sandy area and leaves where the inflow from the groundwater. And then as you're wading a little bit out deeper, you can feel when you're going over a spring. So the next obvious question is this process of eutrophication over a geologic. So eventually those inputs from the groundwater, the springs, can the sediment get so, over a long period of time, just get so much that the springs can't get through and replenish the source of fresh water?
Well, eventually the lake is going to fill in over a geological time frame because everything runs downhill. You don't have to worry about springs filling in because, and people bring this question up a lot. Let's say this lake has, we have this groundwater table, and so there's pressure from this. It will sometimes force groundwater out into the lake here, and that's what people refer to as springs. And sometimes as the lake fills in and lake levels get low, people will think, well, if we dredge the bottom of our lake and clear away this debris, is that going to open up the springs again? And the answer is the water moving in from the bottom here is driven more by the hydraulic pressure from this groundwater table than anything that blocks here. I mean, if any of you have ever had a bucket with a hole in it, or any kind of a leak, it's really hard to plug those things. And here you have a bunch of pressure pushing this water out. So debris along the bottom, whether it be sand or leaves or muck or plants, is not going to prevent the water from coming in. And even if it were, it just finds some other ways in. So.
Is there any federal grant money available for sewer systems?
Okay.
How do you?
Occasionally there is. What is much more common are low interest loan programs, and the state of Michigan has one of those. And one of the big emphasis most recently, partly because of the economic downturn and the idea of putting people to work, is they're providing more money for infrastructure loans to both put in new sewers and new wastewater treatment plants, as well as to refurbish the old ones. The other problem our country has is a lot of our stormwater and wastewater infrastructure is old and needs to be replaced. So there's a mechanism to try to do that, but it's a low interest loan program. It's not a grant program. They've also broadened the scope of that loan program. It's called the State Revolving Fund. And municipal governments can also tap into that to do various non-point source practices too, like if they want to establish a green belt and get some money to do that. But it's a loan program, it's not a grant program, so you have to show you have some mechanism to pay that back. But yeah, right now it's primarily a loan program rather than grants to do that. But there is money out available to help move something like that forward. You have to really look at closely at the economics, how many users will you be able to hook up to the system to make the rates low enough, monthly rates low enough to pay that operating cost and to pay the capital cost back, that it makes sense to put it in. So, that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Do you know of any lake communities in Michigan that have put in these sewer systems, or I think they're called low pressure systems?
A low pressure system.
It has a grinder for the solids.
For a multi-user system, or are you talking about individual?
Multi-user for a community.
Okay, well there are a variety of different systems, and I'm not well versed on the different ones and how they work.
Do you know of any systems that have been put in? I know in Grand Traverse County we have a treatment plant, right?
In the city.
There was one that could be tied into. There were some townships that looked at it. Or it
Maybe
could
the
be
septic treatment plant you're thinking about.
Yeah,
The
septic.
septic treatment plant, so like when people get their septic tanks pumped, that septic waste has to go to the septic treatment.
No, I'm talking about that ties into one of these pressure systems.
Well, a lot of sewer systems have pump stations in them
Right.
to move it from one area to another, so that creates pressure. That's different than what you're talking about.
And I'm not totally familiar with it. There's a gentleman that brought it up. Don?
Yeah,
Okay, it's been several years since we spoke.
yeah,
Don Davis?
yeah.
This gentleman has some information on
Okay, excellent.
Well,
I'm certainly no expert on this, and I did bring it up at the Long Lake Association meeting one time. I brought it up a couple of times for the Long Lake Peninsula Association meeting, or places on the peninsula. And there was some very limited interest in it, but I think what it's Dennis, isn't it?
right.
what I explained was that what's called a force main system, F-O-R-C-E, force main. And the system is a pressurized system which will force the sewage. It goes through a grinder and then into a relatively small conduit, 3 to 4 inches. It has been used in lake areas, mostly I think in southeastern Michigan. And it's adaptable to lake areas because of the varying contours, so it can go up and down over irregularities in the contour. And I did a little research into that, and the reason I came here this evening was to kind of promote this if I could, or at least see if there might be additional interest in the township area. So I got online and I tried to get a lot of information and details, and as you commented here about the sewer system, there has been interest in this whole area about having a sewer system as a replacement for septic systems. You pointed out that Michigan is the only state that doesn't have a statewide guide, I guess, or standards for septic systems. I got that information off of the online magazine, Bridge. I don't know, is everybody familiar with Bridge online magazine? Well, they had an article on there about it, and they pointed that specific fact out. And they pointed out that Michigan has, they estimated 1.3 million septic systems, and they estimated that 10% have failed. So that's a lot of septic systems. So I tried to translate that to Long Lake Township, and I had to make an estimate because I don't know how many septic systems there are here, but I estimated 2,500 to 2,700 septic systems maybe in Long Lake Township. So if 10% of those are failed, that's 250, 270, which to me seemed like a lot of failed systems.
The other thing to keep in mind before you went on that was the definition of a failed system as far as public health departments go, which are who are keeping track of these things, is one that's no longer passing water or you have material bubbling out of the ground. And so it's a threat to the public health, or the homeowner can't use it because the water won't pass through.
Sure.
So as far as the environment goes, you can have septic systems that are passing contaminants straight through to the groundwater or the lake that aren't counted among the ones that are failed in these numbers. So the fail would be your lower limit of where you've got problems.
Well, I don't know if you're interested in this other information I got, but there was a study, I think right here in Long Lake Township, and they concluded that septic systems should last 20 to 30 years if they're maintained. They went on to say that 40% of the septic systems in Long Lake Township were constructed before 1980. And only 6% have been replaced since 1990. So I'm trying to figure that out. So I figured 40% would be 1,000, 6% would be 60. That would mean that there'd be over 950 failed septic systems in the township. So then we get into the cost of it, and I think the big problem is trying to justify the expense of a sanitary sewer system. The figures that I got were in the $10,000 to $15,000 cost per dwelling, okay? And then I noted that the cost to replace a septic system is roughly the same, $10,000 to $15,000. So I figured, because property value, got a good argument, I hope, for the improvement in property values would probably equal that. So there were, at least in my thinking, there was a lot of justification. So my position would be, gee, Long Lake Township should set up a task force. They should look into all the different possibilities, look into costs, look into time, look into sources and that sort of thing. But in my research, I also found out that Long Lake Township has an ordinance 107, that requires an inspection of septic systems. And that's been in effect since November of 2008. So I wondered, there must have been a lot of sales since
Yeah,
2008.
that's a point of sale ordinance. Right?
Right. And so I wondered, is that information collected? Do we have
Absolutely.
information about how many of those
Yeah.
have failed?
There's been, my off-the-cuff estimate of how many have actually failed is probably, the ordinance was adopted in November, but it wasn't until the next May when it took effect. When people began to do the inspections. So we have about, since May of 2009.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe 20
Oh,
were,
really?
have been, out of about,
Well, if it's 2,000, that's 10%. No, if it's 200, that's 10%.
Right.
So, but that's
I
Well,
want
it
to
is-
say about 1,500. But we
1,500.
can,
That's,
now
that's
of all
not-
the sales,
not a lot.
we don't catch every single sale. And if they've sold once and the inspection is less than 3 years old, the report on file, then they don't have to do it again.
Mhm.
But a lot of them are, plus there's different ratings and there's like a few different levels of failure. And a lot of them are, there's about to be a big problem if you don't make a correction. And in most cases, a correction was made prior to the sale. So I think imminent failures were caught and some really serious problems have been caught too. But I do think there are a lot of cases where even through that, they get a very good rating. And yet your drawing might still,
Right, it's
Exists.
passing straight through to the groundwater. It's not getting clogged up. It's
I just want to make one other comment here. In the ordinance, I found this interesting sentence. It says, "The township is under no obligation to take enforcement action if the septic system is not in substantial conformance with the health department's environmental health regulation."
That's because it falls under the health department's jurisdiction to do that, not the township.
So the health department could. Oh, okay, well, thank you. for
all the
that.
failures are reported to the health department. But if they don't meet the current standards, it's just kind of noted, you don't meet current standards. And that's not directly reported to the health department. The standards have changed and it's 20 or 30 years old and
What's more likely to prompt the correction of that is going to be whether the buyer is insist on it or not.
I would think
Most
so.
of them
Yeah.
would.
That's why the point of sale ordinance,
Yeah.
people like that, because if you want to sell your house, you're not going to sell it if your septic doesn't pass muster.
But that is one of the advantages of lakes that do have sewers nowadays. A lot of people see that as a positive when they're looking for places to buy because they know that number one, the lake is protected, and they also know they can use garbage disposal to their heart's content and not worry about messing up their septic system.
Well, another thing to think about that, a newer topic, people are starting to be concerned with is pharmaceuticals. And septics don't get out pharmaceuticals, anything like that. So, you have all the pills you take on a daily basis, and that gets into your septic, that goes right into the water, goes right into the groundwater. Even if your septic system is functioning perfectly, all those chemicals go right to the groundwater. And so, you could be swimming in heart medication. I mean, it's a really small quantity, but just think about, it keeps getting there and it's not getting out of the water. There's studies that have shown that, fish are changing sexes and frogs and, there's more girl frogs than there are boy frogs because of estrogen from birth control pills that are getting into the water. So, there's things that people are just starting to study now that are looking at pharmaceuticals and the effect of pharmaceuticals. And so if you do get a sewer system around your lake, at least, your lake might not have pharmaceuticals in it. But that's not to say like the Traverse City wastewater treatment plant, well, their pharmaceuticals are just getting released to the bay. So I mean, it's a widespread thing, and I don't really know how to fix that problem. But it's more concentrated if all that water from all the people that are around the shoreline, that water is getting right into that lake.
Has there been a discussion of a sewer system around any of the lakes in the township in the past?
I raised the issue at a meeting about 15 years ago, and I was told that sewer system promotes growth.
Oh.
And I said, on the lake, it's already at capacity.
Yeah.
almost.
Right. Well, I probably think because it promotes growth around it, you know, and people like to live on a lake and live in the country. You know, they want to live. And so if you have a lake, or if you have a sewer system on the lake, well, then they can have this development here, patching the sewer system, and you can keyhole that development or something, and you know, they have one little patch of land here, well, 100 homes up here can now access the lake or access the sewer. And so you might get more sprawl outward from your lake, and I think that's what scares people.
You can also prevent that if you choose.
Right, yeah, I mean, you could build a small system, be like, no, capacity is only for this many people around the lake.
But it sounded like there was a request for the township to consider maybe bringing that up for a discussion. So.
Now, on a positive note, I grew up on a lake down by Rockford. They put a sewer system in. It had to be close to 50 years ago. Within a year, you could tell that the water had changed
Is that right?
significantly. Yeah, it was
Excellent.
amazing.
Yeah, my folks have or my in-laws have a cottage down at Crystal Lake, which is by Carson City, Mount Pleasant area. And there's a sewer system around that lake, and there are barely any, weeds, plant growth in it. And it's really nice because, you go into the dock and you jump off, you don't have to worry about plants tickling your feet. And your kids aren't getting in the water saying, ew. So, I mean, you can really tell that the quality of that lake water is nice compared to.
So hopefully we don't have to get to that point up here before we have sewers in place around some of these lakes.
Right, yeah. Mhm.
Question, I'd like you to switch over from the septic systems, the subject of washing boat washing stations. When friends and I get together and talk about it, there's really a range of opinions on boat washing stations and the difficulty of having as a large percentage of the boats washed, some of the liabilities if you tear the paint off of a guy's boat, or but mainly the ability to effectively catch the majority of the boats that are coming from other lakes into your lake. So I was just curious if you have any experience with either the lakes up here. There was an article not that long ago on Crystal Lake's new with that DNR deal they had, and then of course Glen Lake's had one for a while. But you hear various opinions as to whether the time, effort, expense, and of course literally the amount of space that it takes, and to make sure that it's isolated from draining back into the lake. What's your opinion on it? What have you heard?
Well, a few things to offer on that. One is it works best in lakes that have limited access, and so one of the reasons the Crystal Lake folks are excited about that because there is limited public access to Crystal Lake. And so the new access point that they have with that boat walk station will address a lot of the boats coming from different waters going in and out of Crystal Lake. However, they are concerned that there's a launch in town that there's no boat wash there, so people could get in and out without washing. And in my opinion, it helps to slow down perhaps the infestation by different invasive species, but can any of us identify an example of any invasive species that we have successfully stopped from colonizing wherever it was going to colonize? So I think in the long run, it's not going to prevent whatever species are going to get in there from getting in there. Because a lot of times, some of them are transported by birds and other things too. But it is a very important educational and public awareness thing that can be done. And I think that's important. I think part of the reason there's a big international effort right now to address invasive species in the Great Lakes is partly because increasing knowledge that people have of how these things are transported and what damage they can do once they get into a lake. I don't know if you guys have heard any of these numbers on quagga mussels now. They're the hardier version of the zebra mussel that has colonized the Great Lakes and essentially displaced the zebra mussels from Lake Michigan almost entirely. And they've gone out there and done some surveys down. So once you get past the surf zone, wherever you look, you'll find them because they can colonize soft sediments as well as the harder sediments that the zebra mussels are restricted to, or surfaces. And then also they can handle deeper water. So they say pretty much the entire bottom of Lake Michigan is covered by them. They did some estimates of the number that they estimate are there and the amount of water that they can filter each day because they're filter feeders. And Sarah was at the conference a couple of years ago when Gary Fons, no, that wasn't Gary, who was it?
Hans Van Sumeren?
No, maybe it was Gary. Anyway,
Summit?
2 years ago, he mentioned that there's enough quagga mussels in Lake Michigan to filter the entire volume of water in the lake over a certain period of time. Anybody want to guess how long it takes them to filter the entire volume of Lake Michigan? 2 to 4 days. Now, it doesn't mean they're filtering all the water because they're recycling a lot of the stuff that's down by them. They aren't necessarily reaching up to the entire water column, but that's the volume of water that they can filter. And so that's partly why we have these problems out in the Great Lakes now. And it's a real shame that we're dealing with this just because, it came in with some, barge traffic. So I think the awareness that you get from that, having a wash station on a lake is useful for potentially moving ahead. Maybe not necessarily with the invasive species efforts, but with other efforts to protect the lake as well too. I think there's some connections there. And the other thing is, for the educational component, some people are using these mobile washing systems now that they will bring in on, like a festival day or something like that to do the education awareness thing, and they don't have the expense of a permanent boat wash station or manning that all the time. And it gets some of the same message across. They're doing that in some places in the Muskegon River system and in Manistee County now.
Well, a related question to that, one of the other things that comes up in conversation with some friends of mine, they say that one of the problems we're trying to avoid by boat washing is the viral hemorrhagic disease for fish. And then another guy says, well, he says people are just fishing with minnows and they're getting minnows from every bait shop in Michigan, and they're not going to let you dump their minnows out when they're headed to another lake. So the fact that they are using minnows from heavens knows where, there is always a potential that we may get that doggone thing whether we like it or not, and that boat washing won't really address the minnow problem. Any thoughts?
That's why you should, when you dump your bait, when you're done, don't dump it into the lake, dump it on shore or something. That's because that's one of the things we have 4 or 5 things that are good tips for when you're boating. So like when you come out of a lake, if you can't wash your boat, we say wash your boat thoroughly with like 105-degree water, or let it dry for 2 weeks. Well, who's going to take their boat out of the lake and let it dry for 2 weeks? I mean, seriously. Or who's going to take their boat out and go home and heat up some water and power wash it? But there are some things you can do, like all visible plant material on your boat. Well, you can take that off. You can drain your bilge right there. You can not dump your bait. So if you bought bait, and you're done fishing, dump it on land. Or if you bought bait at, a Long Lake bait shop or something, don't take that bait and go to Glen Lake. Try to get the bait from right there. But like you said, with this VHS, the viral hemorrhagic septicemia disease, you could be buying minnows that are infected with that. You put it on your hook, you put it in the water, well then a fish bites it and it gets off the hook and you lose the minnow. So then you have that tainted minnow in your water there. So that's why it's really important for bait shops to know the signs of VHS disease and make sure that the bait shops aren't selling minnows that have this disease. And I think that's an education component for them too. And I'm not sure like what minnows would look like if they have VHS or if they're just a carrier. I don't know enough about that disease, but there are some good housekeeping things to keep in mind when you do go boating if you can't wash your boat. And if you just go to Long Lake, if mostly you just go to Long Lake, you don't need to wash your boat every time you go in and out because you're going to that one lake. But if you like to go to this lake and that lake and that lake and that lake and that lake, it might be a good idea to try to wash your boat, because especially if you're going to a lake that doesn't have a lot of problems, or if you're in a lake that has a ton of milfoil, it has a lot of zebra mussels or quagga mussels, you might want to, if you're going to that lake and then let's say you're going to Glen Lake, which doesn't have a lot of that stuff yet, you might want to be more aware to wash your boat. And I don't know do you know much about minnows and bait and the VHS disease?
No, I know that DNR, of course, is very concerned about
Yeah.
that. And I think they do check at the wholesaler level to try to minimize the chance that there's going to be an outbreak of that. But all the things Sarah mentioned are excellent.
We have a brochure on that back there too.
Sarah, you talked about the E. coli testing that you do on Long Lake. Do you
Yeah,
have any ideas? of
we
the
just,
testing?
we did it quite a few years ago, but then this past year we got a grant through the DEQ to do some inland lake E. coli monitoring. And so far this year, the beach that we've monitored on Long Lake has been really, really low. I think, what was the name of it again?
You said Taylor and Gilbert?
Yeah, are those both on Long Lake? There's so many that we're doing, like we have 21 beaches we're doing this year, and so it's hard for me to keep the 10 new inland lake beaches separate in my mind. So those two ones I'm pretty sure are pretty low, although I seem to remember one of them actually might have gotten an advisory this year, a couple weeks ago. But for the most part, it's been low. The days where we would expect to see a higher reading would be after a large rain event. And something else is if you have, I don't know if you have problems with swimmer's itch in Long Lake. And so swimmer's itch has nothing to do with E. coli. So the tests that we're doing are just E. coli, which is fecal material from warm-blooded animals. So ducks, geese. So if you have a lot of geese on the beach, whenever it rains, all the material from the geese and the ducks that they've pooped out, it gets washed into the water there. And so that's why we warn people if it's during a rain event or it's just after it rained, you might want to stay away from the beach for a while. And usually what happens with the bacteria and the pathogens that are in the fecal material, once the sun comes out, it has the ultraviolet rays in the sun, and that actually kills the bacteria in the water. So if you have a nice, sunny, clear day, the bacteria in the water will die off pretty quickly. And also, there's the solution of pollution is dilution, right? So, eventually it'll get dissipated throughout the lake, and then it'll eventually die off. But we do have water quality monitoring signs at those beaches. So if you're wondering on a day, hey, is it safe to go swim on the beach here? Although we only test on Wednesdays, and that's the issue. Like a lot of people think, oh, this beach is, is getting tested. So we only know if it's good on a Wednesday. So, and actually, technically, the issue that we all have in the water quality beach manager world is that the quickest test we have for E. coli, since it's bacteria, you have to culture the bacteria before you can count it, before you know how much is in the water. Well, it takes 18 hours to culture the bacteria. So I can tell you on Thursday that you shouldn't have been in the water on Wednesday. However, it's, while that's not all that helpful, thanks a lot for telling me I should have been in the water with my kids yesterday. What we do use it for is to see patterns. So if there is a particular beach where every single week it was high, well, we would know, hey, there's a problem there. Or if we saw a beach where we found it was high, and the day that it was sampled, it had just rained or it was raining, then we know that if that beach was high when it was raining, then that's tied to that. Some beaches might have a high result if there's a strong onshore wind, because maybe it's blowing in something from across the lake or down the shore. So, even though it might not be helpful that particular time to know if you should swim, it's helpful for us to know the overall health of the beach. And what we've been finding on a lot of the inland lakes that we've been sampling this year, that they're all really low in E. coli. We're not really concerned about any of them so far, which is good to know. Some of the beaches on the Grand Traverse Bay area where we sample, we know that we have problems when it rains because it's right next to a storm drain. And all the crud that washes out of the storm drain, once it rains, it's right next to the beach. So,
Sarah mentioned the wind. They're also doing some research now and just looking at the sand itself, because once you get down into the sand, it's not exposed to the sunlight and can live there for a while. And then if you get a wave event, is going to, you know, wash the shore with waves, sometimes it resuspends that material, and you can get elevated levels from that as well. So that's not as big of an issue on inland lakes, but on some of the bigger ones, and then also
Right,
the
like the state park in Traverse City, usually when that one has a high rating, it's because there's a really strong onshore wind and all that sediment's getting churned up, and the E. coli that are in that sediment are getting resuspended. But there's a lot of research that's been going on with microbiologists over the past few years to actually look at that. You know, I go to some of these conferences, and most of what they say just flies right over my head because they're all microbiologists talking their own special microbiologist language. But what they're doing is they're looking at the E. coli in the sand to see, well, yeah, that's E. coli in the sand, and that's supposed to be our indicator of fecal pollution or contamination, but is it really telling us that there's fecal contamination there because it's in the sand? You know, it's always there. So if it resuspends itself, it's not telling us that we had something come in and that there's a problem with pathogens. So is that really our best thing to use as an indicator? Should we be using something else? You know, there's lots of other bacteria we can use. You know, but E. coli is the cheapest thing to test for. You know, you can test for human pathogens. You know, there's different bacteria that are specific to the guts of humans, and so if you start testing for that, it's like $200 a pop. So, you know, E. coli is $16 a test. So there's, you know, and it's 18 hours where the human specific one could be a lot more expensive and it takes a lot longer. So there's lots of new research. What I would like someday is to have like a dipstick test where you have like a litmus paper, and you go in and you put it in, and if it comes out and it's blue, don't go swimming. Come out and it's pink, it's all ready to go. And you know, they're working on that. I've attended a webinar a couple months ago, and this company it was kind of like a litmus test, and you know, obviously they were selling a product and they're saying how awesome it was, but it took like 2 hours to do that test. You got the sample, you put it in a bottle, added some stuff to it, put it in their thing, and 2 hours later, you know your result. So I think we're almost there, which is really nice, because I would like to know on Wednesday if I should go swimming on Wednesday. I don't want to know on Thursday.
Any other questions or things you want to discuss? Points you want to make? Requests you have of Leslie?
So you talked a little bit in your presentation about pet waste management. I've never really thought about that. Are there specific recommendations, or do you have a brochure on that?
No, no shit on pet waste. Really just pick up your dog's poop out of your yard.
Tip of the Mid has one if you don't.
Yeah, there's some cute ads, you know, that I've seen about, you know, a dog, someone taking a dog for a walk and it's pooping in the water, and it's like, pick up your poop or something. You know, it's I think basically the pet management thing is pick up your dog waste, or I don't know, let's say you have a pack of llamas at your house, pick up your llama waste. But also, you know, in town it's really serious too, because you have the pet waste, which can wash off a person's yard, get into the storm drains, and that's what causes the high E. coli levels, because that pet waste gets into the storm drain and it sits in it. I like to use the word fester because it's disgusting, but you know, it sits there and it festers and it grows and it multiplies, and that E. coli bacteria multiply, then it rains and it washes that big plume of E. coli out into the water. So, you know, I know you don't really have storm drains around Long Lake or, you know, in your township, but really, I think picking up the waste out of your yard, and also having a buffer between your yard and the lake is really great, because that stops a lot of things from washing off. Even if it's just native grasses or native flowers, you know, doesn't need to be wild, long, unkept, whatever. You know, you can have pretty things along your shoreline. You know, whatever length of buffer you might be comfortable with, but that stops things from running off of your yard, and it gets in before it gets into the water.
It also keeps geese and ducks from getting up on your yard too.
It
'Cause
does.
they don't like coming through that.
Right, because they think foxes are hiding in the grass. So if you can get even like a 2-foot high, you know, grass along your shoreline, that will deter geese, because they'll go someplace else. A good example of that is Hannah Park in downtown Traverse City. which is right across the Borden River from the post office. And they used to have a huge problem with geese at that park. They would come there and hang out and do all sorts of nasty things on the yard there. And we planted a buffer. It was a grant for the DEQ, thank you. And we planted a buffer along that whole entire shoreline. And over the next few years, the city of Traverse City was like, there are no more geese there anymore because, you know, they're not coming up on the shore because they have to waddle through, you know, shrubs and grasses, and they're going someplace else. So that's a good example of it. And it's really a good beach management thing too. You know, I go to a lot of beach meetings. I go to the Great Lakes Beach Association on their advisory board, and some of the things that we talk about is just that for geese management, is having a nice grassy buffer along your shore. You can have a sandy beach, but then where the sand meets the grass, right along there, you can have, you know, a nice 2-foot high grasses or whatever. And you know, I think some people like put owls out or put whatever things out. I think those work for a while, but I think the geese kind of know after a while. And the guys that moved to 2 months, I'm gonna go up there. They're pretty smart.
Anything else from anyone?
We're just a wealth of information up here.
Now's your chance, you guys.
Well, going back over everything we spoke about, what is the single biggest threat to water quality?
I would say septic systems around the lake. And not just because of the pathogens, but because of the nutrients and the, you know, the pharmaceuticals and other things. You know, we don't know what the long-term impacts of some of that stuff is.
Okay, according to your drawing, a septic system can pass the local inspection, but it still may be putting nutrients into groundwater.
Right.
And we had a program some years ago that we came up with the Township of promoting with the green belt. We didn't get a lot of buy-in, but maybe it's time to revisit that again.
One way that some people try to enhance programs like that is they set up like a lake stewardship program, where if you do certain things, like you don't use, well, it used to be you don't use phosphorus fertilizer, you have a green belt, you have your septic system pumped every 5 years or so, you get a little, you know, stewardship flag or something you can post on your property. And that does a couple things. One, people will ask, well, what's that funny looking flag on your lawn or your beach? And you'll start conversations among neighbors that don't necessarily make it to meetings like this to hear some of the stuff or buy the read brochures and stuff. And they'll find out, oh, I didn't know that it was helpful to have a little grassy strip with taller grass by the lawn. You know, they come from the urban. A lot of people move up here from urban areas where they have these perfectly manicured lawns, and it's very hard for some of them to look at an unmowed strip and think that's a good thing. So you start these, neighbor to neighbor discussions and can move things forward. So that's one thing. And then sometimes you get to the point where enough people become aware of things that you end up with peer pressure. And like, why did you put that steel break wall in there rather than something that had more rock and was better for the critters in the lake, provided some habitat or something like that, if you are going to have a hard structured seawall.
And I think we did a mailing with Grand Traverse County a few months ago. I don't know if it was just to all riparian landowners in Grand Traverse County, or I thought we did it to every single landowner in Grand Traverse County, but it was a septic system pump out postcard where, I don't know if anybody you remember getting it, but usually the picture we have on the front is it's a woman with a clothespin on her nose, and the title is "What the Smell is Going On," and then the back of it said something about remember, get your septic system pumped for clean water, protect the watershed or something, and So we like to send out reminders like that. You always get the Williams and Bay pump out card reminder, whatever, but we, sometimes we like to use humor that catches people's attention. And when you see a postcard like that, you might actually read it, or as the Williams and Bay when you're like, So I don't know if any of you remember getting that or seeing it, but that's an option of something to do, is continue to do that. We did a pilot project with Peninsula Township, Old Mission Peninsula, where we send out postcard reminders, I think 3 times in a year. And since they have to get all their septage goes to the septic treatment plant in Grand Traverse County, and they have treatment records, and what they found is that their septic system pump out rate significantly increased the year that we sent our postcards out, because we sent them out 3 times, because what we've learned at the Watershed Center in advertising and marketing education is that people have to see things more than once. You can't just send them one thing, you have to send it again and again and again, and the 3rd time they're like, oh, I keep getting this, I need to do this, okay. And so it actually worked, you know, when we did that with Peninsula Township. It was really great, and so we talked to the county about it, and you know, they decided they wanted to send out a postcard to Grand Traverse County. So we might be doing more of that in the future, but that's also something to think about as a township too, you know, to do mailings like that to remind people, or if you have a township newsletter, you know, things like that, it's just to say, hey, don't forget, pump your septic. You know, 500, 3, 4, 500, I'm not sure what it costs these days, but it's a lot cheaper to do that every 5 years than to have it fail and pay 10 to 15,000, you know, or to impede the sale of your home if you're trying to sell your house.
Or sometimes a lot of the older systems don't meet code anymore, and people have to put in mounted or raised systems,
Yeah.
and then they're paying to pump things, or even have holding tanks where they have to, you know, really watch their water use because they can't
Yeah.
discharge any of it after they pump it all out. So
Yeah.
the longer you keep your system operating, the better for the individual homeowner.
Is there anything people can do, like you have that, you know, picture up there with the septic tank, and it's kind of directly to the groundwater. Is there anything people can do to reduce the impacts of that, like putting it? I mean, I don't think putting a buffer along shore, you know, with the plants, would the roots reach the groundwater and kind of pull some of those nutrients out, or is it kind of?
Well, it's more likely
Too
that
far.
it's going to go down like this, and
Right.
you won't necessarily get the roots that are up there.
Yeah.
Uh,
So really, the best thing to do would be to pump your system.
yeah.
Make sure.
I mean,
it's
I
functioning.
suppose if you wanted to spend a bunch of money, you could put more loam-type soils underneath the sand that your tiles are in
Right.
to capture, to have more surface area to bind to the phosphorus and some other things. But I have not heard of anybody actually doing
But
that.
that's so expensive, and might as well just
Yeah.
get a sewer.
Or the mound systems. Yeah, I like your number about, you know, what it costs to replace a septic system versus what it may cost to, you put in a sewer. And you put in the sewer one time and you're done with it, plus you protected your lake and
Yeah.
enhanced your property value.
Yep. You gotta get good buy-in though, because,
And it's economic numbers like that that are very important when you have that kind of a discussion about a sewer system around the lake.
yeah.
You may not know this, but if you have a community septic system and then a public system goes in, or a sewer system goes in, do those community septic systems just get tied into it, or they're replaced by, or can they bypass it?
Well, I don't know what the requirements are on that kind of thing. I would assume it would be a case-by-case thing, and I don't think they would require that they be connected. If they've already got their own system and it's working okay, I don't think there'd be a requirement that they would tie in. I imagine they might like to have it as a future option, but I don't know for sure. You know, we don't have a statewide septic system code, but we do have statewide requirements for wastewater treatment systems and you know, how you build those and how you fund them and site them and all those kinds of things, what's required and who connects and that. So a lot of that stuff, there are guidelines for actual requirements. So, but I don't know what they are. But we have an engineer in our office that issues the permits for those kinds of things, and he knows that stuff. Usually if people are, you know, have a discussion locally about whether they want to pursue, you know, a sewer system, they get in touch with some sort of an engineering consulting firm and say, well, we're interested, but we don't know how much money we would have to put toward it or what it would mean for us. And they'll oftentimes come out and hold a meeting and talk with folks and discuss some things, give you some stuff to think about.
Those can be done through special assessments?
This is a pay this. You know, I think you can use that, but usually it's a user fee system, so the people that are connected are the ones that pay for it. But I think there are some other ones where they do even assess people to recover some of the capital costs, even if they haven't connected, that chose not to connect because it's there for them now. So it does enhance their property even if they aren't connected because there's the option to connect. So they don't have to pay the operating costs, but I think they do sometimes get tagged for some of the capital costs. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I have an architect friend that tuned me into this force main system. And back when I first started kind of talking about it, and maybe Dennis will remember that actually, I got the name of an engineering firm that specifically worked with the force main systems. So if it ever progressed, I'm sure I could find out that information still. That's several years ago, so I don't know if they're still in business, of course, but I suspect they probably are because I think they were a good-sized firm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like one route would be to maybe have the township talk with some of the local lake associations and see if any of them have any interest in pursuing something like that, or at least inquiring to see what it might involve.
I've been surprised that the people who have holding tanks haven't made some noise about it. I would think that would be very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. You would think they would be in favor of it.
Well, we will be around, and if you ever want to call my office and ask me questions, we're right in Traverse City. So. Greg's in Cadillac, that's not far away either.
Not by phone or email.
Yeah.
And Leslie has that information.
I have a question for Leslie, since we're on this. Has there been any significant changes as far as people putting in, or I guess maybe you don't know, it's maybe the county, going to holding tanks? Has it been situations or?
I don't know that. I always hear, maybe someone else here knows this, but I always hear that the county frowns on holding tanks. I don't know that they allow new holding tanks.
Oh, okay.
Is it holding tanks or mounded systems? Because a lot of counties don't like the mounded systems.
They do. I think there are some mounted systems.
I think they like the mounted better than the holding tanks here.
Okay. All right. Why is that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
A lot of people don't seem to agree with the policies of the health department, but they're beyond us. So.
All right.
Well,
Thank
wow,
you.
I thought we'd go a
You're
little
welcome.
over, but perfect. Thank you so much. We've got lots of more snacks in the back. If you need some to take home with you. Cookies for the kids.
You're welcome.